final session of the day. A very large elephant should be now appearing in people's minds, because the one thing that we haven't spoken very much about at all, or at least when it seems the conversation has been about to veer into politics, let alone geopolitics, there's quite often a quick veering away. But our final panel is going to be addressing this head on. We're going to be looking at geopolitics. Is it a hindrance or a catalyst to the global energy transition? It's a question that's never really been very easy to answer, but after a certain election in November last year, it's become a lot harder. We've heard a lot today about how the energy transition is really happening at pace in China, but far less so elsewhere. And, there's a really big question now, I think, about what happens now that the Trump administration is in the process of unleashing a new era of trade. Let's just put it that way and stop there, because we don't quite know how it's going to play out. But it's a really interesting question about what that means when it comes to forging new collaborations, maintaining old ones. So to look into that and many more questions, I'd like to invite our panellists to the stage, please, and also our moderator, Simon Retallick, who is the director of the Carbon Trust's Net Zero Intelligence Unit in Latin America. Thanks. Over to you, Simon.
Fantastic. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. Congratulations for lasting the course. Thank you for still being with us for this final panel of the day. As we were hearing, we've had a lot about the energy system, the technologies, the policies, the finance we need. This is our chance now to talk about the politics, and in particular the international politics of the energy transition. I'm very conscious that we're all that stands between you and the drinks reception that's happening shortly. So I know the pressure is on to make this good, but I can promise you we're in for a treat. We have a fantastic panel, and we've got some really interesting questions, hopefully, that we're going to get some interesting answers to on some of all this. Clearly, there have been some key political developments in some of the world's major economies in the last few weeks that we will be wanting to understand the impact of, particularly in as much as they could affect the scale and pace of the energy transition, and crucially, how other countries could and should respond. Beyond the impact on any individual countries, we'll be exploring the nature of the political spaces between them to understand how new alliances, new strategies can be formed or rekindled so that the world continues to transition to clean energy at the pace that we require. So in what may be fairly gloomy days for this agenda, particularly given the dark clouds blowing from across the Atlantic in the last few weeks, we'll be exploring where the sources of light might be when it comes to the geopolitics of the clean energy transition and where the opportunities for progress can be found. I'm delighted to be joined today by a truly knowledgeable, wise and experienced group of people, starting with Amisha. Amisha Patel, to my left, is an independent advisor in offshore wind and energy policy. She's recently been serving as the interim head of Secretariat at the Global Offshore Wind Alliance, which promotes offshore wind growth globally, and was previously the global head of public affairs and policy at Mainstream Renewable Power. Amisha, warm welcome to you. Bernice Lee is an expert on the geopolitics of climate change, resource security, international trade, China, and many other things. She's a distinguished fellow and senior advisor at Chatham House, where she was director of energy, environment, and resources, amongst quite a few other roles, I think, at Chatham House over the years. She's also currently a member of the UK Climate Change Committee's International Advisory Group. Bernice, welcome. Nick Bridge, at the end, has worked for many years as a diplomat and senior civil servant on global environmental and economic issues. He was UK Special Representative for Climate Change under 5 British Foreign Secretary, is no mean feat, leading the UK's successful bid to host COP26 and helping to deliver the Glasgow Climate Pact. Before that, he was British ambassador to the OECD and the IEA, as well as Foreign Office chief economist with diplomatic postings to China, Japan, and the United States, all of which hopefully will put him in good stead to answer some of the questions coming his way in a moment. Now, last but not least is Rachel Kite, who was appointed UK Special Representative for Climate in October last year. She has served as Vice President and Special Envoy for Climate Change at the World Bank, where she led action on climate finance in the run-up to the Paris Climate Agreement. She was also Special Representative of the UN Secretary General and CEO, we were just hearing, of Sustainable Energy for All. She's also Professor of Practice in Climate Policy at the Blavatnik School in Oxford and is Dean Emerita of the Fletcher School at Tufts University, where she was the first woman to lead the United States' oldest graduate-only School of Global Affairs. What a panel, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us. So, to start with, I think we probably have to begin with the impact of the new Trump presidency, as it's on pretty much everyone's minds. The Financial Times reported this week that Donald Trump has eliminated more than 70 climate and green energy initiatives in his first week in office. 70. That's less like policy making and probably more like arson, if you like me, if you think like me. But firstly, Rachel, what could the impact on the global clean energy transition be, particularly to begin with, the US withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, rescinding US emission reduction targets, and lastly, freezing US climate aid? Where does that leave the agenda for COP30, the updating of NDCs, and international climate finance goals?
Thank you. Is this working?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's good to be here. There's lots of experts in the crowd I can see, and as well as on the panel. So you're probably not going to like the first part of my answer, but it's a little too early to tell. Why do I say that? The cabinet picks are going through their Senate confirmation hearings and are coming into office. I think they are on the basis of their previous records. They are not aligned in a view around climate change or global green growth or how to promote sustainable economic development overseas or at home. That may well be something that gets worked out around a cabinet table, or it's a function of a style of management that we've seen from President Trump before, where he sort of pits people together and watches to see who wins. And so I think that both in terms of the US's own trajectory and how the US shows up overseas, it's a little too early to tell. However, the immediate, we saw this before in the first Trump administration, the withdrawal of the US from the Paris Agreement, and at the moment it is just the Paris Agreement, although there are some murmurings that this may actually extend to the underlying convention. So the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement softens the ambition of others. So the Financial Times, the paper of record on all things climate, has reported that maybe Argentina would withdraw as well. We wait to see. Other countries, I think, see that, well, if the US is not driving, then why do we need to come out publicly with an extraordinarily ambitious nationally determined contribution? And this is the month when countries should be filing them. That doesn't mean to say, however, that softening of political ambition and its expression is the same as what's actually going on in the energy transition. So as Damilola said, I was in Tanzania last week, and the Qataris, the UAE, investors from the east, investors from the north, investors from all over Africa were all there, and it was all about doubling down on investments in the renewable energy build out, but also in the supply chains around that. You heard from Chris Stark this morning. This is a country that wants to attract more inward investment into renewable energy and into the picks and shovels of the renewable energy supply chain. We also want to invest in other countries' energy transition, and I'll be going with Ed Miliband to India on Sunday. And so, the science didn't change. The overall objective didn't change. And again, when you look at US business, those that are committed into this trajectory are trying to work out what exactly all of this means. And those who want to see an opportunity are still looking. So you can talk to one person who will say, well, we're going to build gas off the pipelines all the way through the Midwest, and that's what's going to power data centers. Talk to anybody on the coasts, and they're like, no, we're not going back into a gas economy. We're committed. If you talk to the office of the governor of Massachusetts, maybe some of that wind doesn't get built now. That's a loss of jobs because those jobs were coming onshore as well as offshore. So I think it's a little too early to tell. It would be better if everybody was united in the speed with which we need to achieve the energy transition. But we can survive this, and you'll see a plurilateralism emerging of countries from the global south and the global north that are committed to moving the transition more quickly, and we'll be at the heart of that.
Fantastic. Rachel, just briefly, could I follow up on one aspect of the international climate negotiations that clearly has emerged as being really important, the finance track, and the ask in Baku for $1.3 trillion of support from developing countries. Where do you feel that now lies, given the change in government in the US?
So there was a dirty little secret that everybody knew, but didn't really get articulated in open forum about the commitments of the United States around climate finance going back quite a long way, which was that no Democratic administration was able to get any big new commitments through Congress. And so John Kerry could make, big promises, and he did, and the government could sort of make other promises, and kind of in the room, everybody knew that that wasn't necessarily going to be there. That's the bilateral commitments. I think what is worrying, but again, it's too early to tell, is that the US share and the use of its voice and vote in the MDBs, those slow, clanky MDBs that Damilola described, that becomes a little worrying, because whether or not they go after them, and there's sort of some friends of the administration saying things in the papers in the US at the moment, or whether they just provide a sort of hushing effect on the ambition of those institutions, that becomes more problematic, because we need a reform of the MDBs to pick up speed. We need reform at the IMF in order to help countries have the fiscal space that they need to invest in their energy transition. So again, too early to tell, but the $300 billion to $1.3 trillion is something we'll be working on all year, and really explaining how at a country level that $300 billion gets you to $1.3 trillion. US investors will be part of that. Will the US bilaterally? And we don't even know at this point whether MCC exists, whether DFC exists, what happens to there'll be a slew of legal challenges to some of the things that have been stopped.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. We might come back to some of those questions. Amisha, I'm going to turn to you next. Another set of actions that the new Trump presidency has adopted is effectively pausing funding for clean energy through the Inflation Reduction Act and pausing leasing for both onshore and offshore wind. What do you think the impact could be on the broader global clean energy transition of those measures?
Thanks, Simon. I think we're already starting to see some of the impacts of these decisions already across the borders. Impacting international investment. We've seen shares in European wind companies drop after these actions have been taken. And also there is a spread of disinformation and misinformation around wind as well, and an anti-wind narrative which is starting to spread. So we've got a lot of work to do in combating that. In terms of the exec orders, they've halted federal permitting and leasing for new offshore wind. Now, in the US, there is already an 18-gigawatt pipeline of projects in permitting. So there is a strong development pipeline, and there's 6 gigawatts under construction as well, and a lot of state leadership driving through. I think there's at least a coalition of 11 states that are really looking to drive and have collaborative efforts to still drive offshore wind momentum. So I think we need to really work as an industry with this state-level leadership and proponents of wind and the climate agenda and the energy transition within the US to make sure that that momentum continues. I also want to just mention, in terms of the wind industry, the US, like other markets in the world, have been facing economic pressures, inflation, high interest rates, supply chain constraints over the last couple of years. We've seen that, but we've also seen very positive policy responses, the UK being one of the markets where we've seen adjustments to auctions. In the US itself, we've seen NYSERDA in New York respond to these challenges. So there is resilience amongst policymakers and markets globally responding to these challenges. Now, going to the IRA, this is quite an interesting one. A very, very progressive policy measures that were introduced, tax credits which are very instrumental to the offshore wind industry growing. And it really started to spearhead domestic manufacturing and supply chain as well. So it remains to be seen what the impact of that being frozen is going to mean. It does require action from Congress to be revoked. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty that's in the market, but I would say all is not lost. And in terms of the IRA, we saw the introduction of that really spark a response globally. We saw the EU come out with a package of measures to make the investor climate more attractive and respond to that package of measures as well. So we've already seen positive impacts of that policy being introduced elsewhere. And I think just broadly, I'm an optimist, so I think broadly on the Trump presidency and the impacts of this widespread is that we've been here before. Again, I will say that as proponents of the energy transition, the climate agenda, and renewable energy, we need to make sure that we really support the proponents on ground and in market. And also, where others step back, it's an opportunity for others to step forward and step up as well. And the Global Offshore Wind Alliance is definitely in existence to support that effort. I'll pause there because I can talk about this forever.
Fantastic. Thanks, Amisha. And we might well come back to some of those themes in a moment. I'm going to turn to Bernice now to ask you to tell us what you think the impact of the Trump presidency's tariffs on imports from China and quite possibly other countries in due course could have for the clean energy transition.
Thank you, Simon. So we are talking about a president of a country who loves tariffs. And I've been trying to understand what that means, what this loving tariff really means. I think it kind of goes back a little bit to sort of what was a rather old-fashioned mercantilist idea about that imports are bad, exports are good. So if that's what it is, we should remind ourselves that I think all of you would know, between 2009 to 2023, lifetime cost of utility scale storage went down, I think, something like, I forgot how many percent now, suddenly it will come to me. Offshore wind, 67%, I think it was 83%, and solar, 80%, all of which in no small part is owed to trade. Obviously, if you put cost on trade, it will affect many things, including energy transition. And I was just looking at the numbers just this weekend about Mexico and Canada. Look at what it means for clean energy transition. I don't know whether we know that a lot of parts for clean energy grid, for example, do come from Mexico and Canada. Canada supply half of, I think, processed nickel for U.S. nickel production, for example. For nickel for U.S. batteries. Among others, Mexico is obviously where a lot of electric vehicles by, for example, General Motors are being produced. So in some sense, we can see immediately some of the problems Having said that, however, we also know that the markets for clean energy and clean energy products and electric vehicles, for example, are going to be increasingly going to be found in emerging economies. And therefore, in some sense, even though it is true that it does have the kind of wow factor at the moment, that we have a commander-in-chief of one of the most important countries in the world effectively behaving like a petro state, trying to stop anything clean energy going through any nooks and crannies of the international economic system. Perhaps the good news is that actually they're no longer the only driver of change that they might think of themselves in the past. And in fact, that hasn't been the case for a long time. And this is why energy transition has continued to happen, despite the fact that the US sometimes plays hot and cold. And we also know that despite the fact that it plays hot and cold, even though the political wind is not blowing currently, it certainly feels like it's blowing the wrong way. We know that the market trends that we talked about earlier is blowing the right way. I don't know whether, again, I was looking at the numbers this morning. I think Exxon, Shell, and Chevron is posting lower profits in this quarter compared to last year, the same quarter, because of market trends, oil prices, all sorts of other things. So in some sense, economic wind, technology winds are not blowing the wrong way yet, partly because we know that the science is also telling us that action is actually sensible, not just politically sensible, but actually really sensible. So if geopolitics is not the law of physics, so hopefully the actual law of physics will help us, because climate impacts will continue.
Fantastic. Bernice, you've given us some hope there, as all of you have so far. Nick, I'm going to turn to you. I'm thinking about your experience, years of travel to most of the world's major economies in the context of your climate envoy role. Where do you think the new leadership is going to emerge from? Thinking of the international negotiations in particular. And by the way, I should say we're very honoured to have the Colombian ambassador to the UK here with us this afternoon. Interesting changes in government in the region. We've seen leadership on this from Colombia, Brazil, Chile, hopefully Mexico, maybe early to say, but hopefully too, from Claudia Sheinbaum. Where do you see new coalitions or alliances of progressive countries forming to keep the momentum going on this move to a cleaner energy economy?
Thank you, and thanks Carbon Trust for doing this. It's great, and agree with everything that's been said so far. One quick and obvious one is around a high ambition coalition of countries. The high ambition coalition, the one that was literally called that some years ago, was a really critical player that the UK was a driving force behind. Colombia and Mexico and others were also very influential on. And something like that, but much bigger, more powerful, I think more urgent, is ready to be done. And I think the UK can be a huge part of that, and Europe can be a huge part of that, because there is a sort of a lack of direction at the moment, I think, in terms of these kind of leadership roles. What was striking throughout my time was, actually even more striking once Russia-Ukraine started, was that the developed countries would go to the UN General Assembly each year and talk about geopolitics as Russia-Ukraine, maybe Gaza, now that that's happening. The rest of the world would go and talk about where's our development, our sustainable development, the climate change crisis, the environmental crisis. And the two sets of countries were talking past each other. So it's a huge opportunity to reset that and to talk together about the cooperation that's needed. And if you look at just an event like the Paris Agreement or the COP26 Glasgow Agreement, there is no other issue that is unifying like that still. So we would get all the world leaders to come sign an incredibly complex and detailed, ambitious document. Now you can say signing it's one thing, acting on it's another, but to get that kind of unification around an agenda is still there, it's still possible. And particularly so in the context of Trump, because I was involved in dealing with the first Trump administration very closely, and it was a bit of a shambles, coal, and we knew it was not going to happen, and it didn't happen. It came out of Paris, and other people stepped up. There hasn't been that kind of noise this time around, other countries saying, we carry. Now, Trump is almost though a voice representing a much wider and more difficult and insidious set of populist, social media-driven misinformation, disinformation type tendencies that have only accelerated and got much stronger. So it's not as much about Trump. It's about the fact that this whole unifying agenda that we got through Paris and through Glasgow and onward, is at risk, including because as climate impacts and biodiversity impacts and countries just struggle and go backwards on sustainable development goals, these kind of forces get get strengthened. So the high ambition side of it, I think, has got enormous potential. There's nothing between us and the Colombians, the Brazilians, all the small island and vulnerable states. I think there's a brilliant opportunity there. Similarly, across Europe, this enormous potential in the North Sea as a sort of a massive hub. Offshore wind is going to happen everywhere else in the world, and we can leave the Americans behind if that's the way they want to play it, and they'll then probably change their minds because it'll be a winning solution. Let me focus on China for a minute, though. I mean, China is the big one, and I think there's a meta geopolitical point here, which has not got into, I think, the mindsets of almost any political leadership, which is that China alone has a trajectory that on one sense, as we know, is phenomenal with the clean investment. In another sense, has carbon budgets due to its embedded fossil fuel sector, along with the US, that do not allow us to get to the 1.5 or the 2 degrees on their own. So the importance of every country recognizing that it, in some senses, is no longer in control of its own destiny. What happens in China, to some extent India, the US, if they don't dramatically accelerate 5-6 times more in getting fossil fuel out, not just doing the clean stuff, we are beholden to that diminishing of the carbon budget. So the importance, therefore, of two things, of having our own agenda, which is impressive in the UK, and getting our own house in order is absolutely critical. And rather than just hearing people say, well, it doesn't matter what we do, it's all about China. Absolute nonsense. What we do is absolutely totemically important to ourselves and to others. But secondly, having a massive ramping up of cooperation and engagement with all countries, but especially the G20 countries like China. We, under the last government, very foolishly withdrew some intensive discussions, the likes of I was having with the National Expert Committee on Climate Change in China, where we could really share projections of what the best possible peaking and decline scenarios were, what the best possible collaborations on the trade investment agenda were, where we could share technology, where we could do massive transformation of the other big sectors, not just energy, but transport and all the other big things that need doing. So I think China, there's a huge opportunity, disagreeing on some things, agreeing on other things, et cetera, et cetera. That's looping back around perhaps to Trump, is one of the biggest problems with the Trump situation, is how much the Chinese look to the US to calibrate their own approach internationally. It was never a hugely ambitious collaboration, but the US-China axis it was a necessary but not sufficient condition for Paris, same for Glasgow. Now, not knowing quite where the US is something that the Chinese will use, but not necessarily in a positive way. It lets the pressure off. So that's where you come back to things like the High Ambition Coalition. I mean, the Chinese do care a lot about their reputation in Africa, their reputation across the global south.
Nick, fantastic. Rachel, I was going to come to you briefly in this. I know you also lived through the Trump presidency in Washington, first time round, I believe. Turning to the UK role in this, building on what Nick was saying, obviously, in addition to walking the talk as a key member of the G7, the G20, what role do you see for the UK in catalysing and supporting, fostering some of the high ambition coalition type initiatives that Nick was referring to there? Do you think we need more plurilateral, bilateral partnerships to achieve action in the Trump 2 era?
So I think that, so let's take the sort of the big emitting countries who, if they don't succeed, nobody succeeds, right? So with these countries, we need fully rounded strategic partnerships, and those are in some cases underway with the new government, and others will come into focus in the near future. So we need, and these are partnerships cast in a modern age. We are, we are a government wishes to be a pragmatic partner. We need to be able to marshal all of our own investment resources, private and public, and be seen to be responsive to the scale of the transitions that these countries are going through. We have know-how, notwithstanding some of the really complicated pieces of our own energy transition that still remain to be worked through, and I'm sure Chris talked about that this morning. We do actually have know-how, and we have a lot of the pieces of the puzzle which other countries are trying to work through. So, if there are, take the 10, most important grids in the world that aren't performing well enough at the moment, then those grids need to be talking to each other constantly about what we're learning about how to manage grids. Where are the top 12 interconnectors that need to be built in the world, and how are we going to work around that? And that's the kind of thing that we will be working on in this new global clean power alliance. But so those countries have to have fully rounded, where we're not leading with overseas development assistance, we're leading with investment, the role of the London Stock Exchange, the home of London as a green financial centre, and know-how, the know-how that we already have in the national grid and elsewhere, and on and on and on. And we're learning from them as well, especially on the resilience agenda. Then we go to, I think, the least developed countries and small island developing states, where the Foreign Secretary wants to completely reset our relationship with the Global South. Because we have a historic relationship with many of these countries, but their resilience is because of the protection of their nature and the way in which we support them and work with them on their own resilience. That's a different kind of partnership than a historic relationship from empire or the Commonwealth, or seeing them as recipients of development assistance only. And I think that we've tried very hard to be a bridge between Europe and North America and those parts of the world, because we do have substantial ties and entanglements with those countries. So I think the people are looking at the UK for pragmatic leadership. They're looking for us to move back into a zone of pragmatism that we walked away from in recent years. And we see ourselves as building bridges to the Global South for a different partnership conversation. Look at the Bridgetown Initiative and other pieces of how that's expressed. And then for these big middle-income countries, a true partnership. So, India, China, it's about their energy transition and other pieces of the technology. For Indonesia, Brazil, the DRC, this is about, what happens to the world if we don't invest in their forests while they're standing, right? So you can walk your way through the G20. And even with Saudi Arabia, right, where we have I think as an international community, a sort of standoff in the negotiations, whether it be the plastic convention or whether it be COPs on climate or other issues, but where actually their build out of their technology for the green energy transition is substantial and will involve their investment in the UK and our investment in them. It's not too many years away before we see solar being, solar electrons moving from Saudi Arabia along the Red Sea into the EU, into the European power markets. It's not too far before you start seeing a building out of Saudi investment, I think, into green technologies and green energy in sub-Saharan Africa. So with everybody in the G20, with maybe one exception at the moment, we can build a pragmatic partnership.
Rachel, thanks very much. Misha, did you want to come in briefly on some of those questions?
I think it was just a point to build on one of the points that Nick made around, I guess, public engagement and public acceptance. And I think in all of this, it's going to be very important, geopolitically, but globally, to really frame the climate and energy transition in this and look at the intersectionalities as well. So really linking the socioeconomic benefits across markets, but also with the nature positive, and then the sort of the pollution and health impacts as well. I think it's almost changing the narrative back to that. I think now more than ever, we really need to weave that into the conversations globally.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's come to that. There are so many things we could come back to, but let's quickly come to that. One of the biggest challenges probably to the clean energy agenda globally, but certainly in Europe right now, is the rise of the sort of populist, nationalist right who have decided to make clean energy and climate action a sort of an opposition to it, as an article of faith almost. What are the right narratives and the right policies to counter that could resonate most with populist constituencies to ensure that the move to clean energy is sort of protected and scaled up? What sort of alliances are needed, thinking particularly within Europe, to make sure that happens? Nick, any thoughts on that?
I'm reading Don Quixote at the moment, which has got this mad, delusional old man who sort of tilts his spear at windmills and it sort of helps give me some sort of comedic relief from just the scale of what people like Donald Trump are sort of enabling and unleashing. And I think it's more that at the moment he sort of is moving the Overton window or moving the norms. And I think it's incredibly important that democratic governments don't give too much space to a lot of this debate and focus on the debate that really does matter around equity and around jobs and around building up every part. Like, we can tell an unbelievable story in this country. I would get, and Rachel will get access at cabinet level in every G20 country in the world because of the Climate Change Act, because of the out of coal into offshore wind, regenerating regions of Britain and so on. It's an incredible story. But the sort of right-wing media, the social media disinformation, the populism trends are only going to accelerate, as I said, partly because countries are going to get more chaotic and storm-ridden and so on and so on. So I think we've got to decide what we are going to engage on and what we're not going to engage on, and actually smash past a lot of the stuff that we get caught up in. So I think turning the telescope around is really important, and looking at this from the perspective of, our political leadership, our local leaders. That everyone's not sitting there thinking about how do we make the climate transition. We have to get into the space you just mentioned of understanding that day to day, get pushed and pulled by local agendas of economic prosperity, of nature and so on. And I think I go back to the data and to the survey evidence that the vast majority of people care very, very deeply about their community and their place and their nature and their job and their family and art and beauty and love and et cetera, et cetera. They really, really, in a deep way, care about that stuff. And they're not sitting there going, where's my economic growth, by the way? Nothing against economic growth, but it's a strange proxy for what we're actually trying to achieve here, which is prosperity and health and happiness and well-being. So I think we've got to have a fundamental look at the economic conversation, a fundamental look at the financial conversation, and not go along with this narrative of, well, greed is good and so on. And I think most people come with you. Just look at the membership of our National Trust and all our charities and all our community organizations. So I think that's a very powerful thing that we consistently underplay. And actually that undercuts, I think, a lot of the populist agendas, because it is about place and community and regeneration and wealth and health and happiness. I should have probably said more about health, because that's people really care about their health. And so we're not talking about poisoning our school children because of our car exhaust fumes. We're not talking about these really obvious things that undercut these ridiculous battles about low traffic neighborhoods or whatever. We're not being tough enough and strong enough and blunt enough about how important it is that we look after everybody and come through this and create something more sustainable. So I'd like to see a much bigger narrative on what actually matters to people, and to reflect that much more in the government's goals. I totally understand Rachel Reeves's growth narrative to get taxes, to invest in public services, etc. That's fine. But I think a more central narrative has got to be about some of these things that people really feel in their gut, and that we have the answers to. But we have to look at it from that perspective, not from the kind of, well, how do we make money out of this? Now that we know the economics are in our favour, that's brilliant and vital. But I think we can come back then to actually thinking much more about the communities that, the community issues that people want to see acted upon. And I think every local authority in the country will have a phenomenal green project and sustainable investment, bit of infrastructure, will be part of the clean grid, will be building their own solar on their roofs, et cetera, et cetera.
Fascinating. Thank you, Nick. Please. Bernice, the economic narrative element of what Nick was talking about is obviously important in the context of the rise of populism. One of the challenges Europe has, amongst other developed economies, is to toe a fine line when it comes to China on this, because clearly China has been hugely successful in deploying renewables faster than any other country in the world. But at the same time, it dominates 60% of global zero carbon technology manufacturing and captures a lot of the economic benefits of that. Firstly, what are the lessons, I suppose, from that experience, China's success, but also what is the right balance that countries in Europe, the UK included, need to tread between benefiting from the speed and scale of deployment that Chinese low-cost products offer, the move to a clean energy future, whilst ensuring that the economic benefits are also captured locally, and the risks associated with dependence on China for critical minerals are diversified and mitigated.
Thank you.
Big question, sorry, Bernice.
No, it's all right. It's all right. It's a fun one, actually. Look, I mean, what did we learn? It's funny. I kept asking ourselves to learn the right lessons, because it's often easy to pick something that is obvious. That you say, well, they have government subsidies. Let's subsidize. Well, that's one way, and we all know that subsidies is going to run out soon, everywhere, really. On the other hand, you know, what we learned from China's success, really, is how innovation is not done the way we used to think it was done. We used to think that it happens in the lab, then we go and invest in it, pilot them, then we roll them out. And what we realize now is that a lot of innovation actually happens as we do. Because what happened was that because they started manufacturing early and started manufacturing at scale early, they had a chance to get to know the consumers a lot earlier than otherwise. So that means that, you know, innovation constantly happens as we do. So the lesson we learned there is that doing matters, doing them fast matters, and doing them at scale really matters. Now, it's not something that everyone can do on their own, evidently. However, it is something that people can do separately together. So the question then becomes, can we actually create that kind of scale together separately in the current political climate that we just talked about already? And that, of course, is a big question that we have to negotiate. And if we take the starting point that is not the law of physics, again, you know, energy and geopolitics is not the law of physics, we can certainly think through ways through which we can actually do things better, separately, together, and figuring out how a less global market will still create the kind of scale that we need without having to replicate things everywhere at the same time. Because one thing we do know is that if everyone wants to build their own industries at home in the same way, then we won't get to the scale economy that we saw that led to the kind of cost reduction that we saw, that led to China producing, whatever, 60% on lithium, you know, battery, etc. So I have all the numbers that I was studying this morning that is now gone out on the other ear. But, you know, you get the drift.
Yes.
And someone please fact-check me. Rather humblingly, I just got fact-checked by a newspaper this morning, very seriously fact-checked, and I'm quite impressed by it, to be fair. So it's good to know that facts still matter in some places. Now, that wasn't the newspaper. Well, we shall find out. However, the question as to what the mix should be, it comes down to that same question. If doing matters, implementation matters, then the question is whether or not countries are still the right level to think through these plurilateral collaboration. Or should it be thought through where the value chains are and where the investments are going to be, and therefore we think about these plurilateral or these coalition building in a slightly different way, where we look at value chains where it matters. Now, we know a couple of them really matter, right? We know transition away from coal in Southeast Asia really matters. We know bioeconomy, probably land restoration in Brazil really matters. We know, Rachel mentioned just now, green industries in India, China really matters. So the question then becomes whether we can have these coalitions that cut across sectors, value chains, but also countries at the same time, that really deliver the kind of result. And hopefully in so doing, because it's not just about countries, so we don't necessarily have to drink the political Kool-Aid, even though, frankly, the politics of the runners and riders of Trump is currently driving me a little bit mad. Because at the moment, this politics of runners and riders haven't quite come to the point where we get to be relatively more honest about the climate impacts and other things just yet. So my suggestion would be that we focus on what type of coalitions and relationships and also implementation needs are in order to fix the problem, and we use that as a way to build the kind of partnerships we talk about. Now, China is obviously going to be part of all of these in one form or another. But if we do not think of them as just bilateral, nor do we think of them as us or them, and therefore do we want them or not, but think through the components around which some of these value chains are going to happen, then maybe we can look at partnership in a different way. Now, we always focus on critical minerals in China, and my more learned colleagues in Chatham House in the Africa program. And again, if I quote them wrongly, I'm really scared right now. But I understand that if you look down the line, in 5 to 10 years' time, most of the critical minerals projects in Africa are owned by Emiratis and the Saudis. And so in some ways, we are talking about different kind of partnerships looking to the future in order to produce this stuff differently. So these provide us with different entry points from otherwise what I consider to be, for better or worse, sort of one way of looking at it that may not get us out of the do we want to or do we not to kind of conundrum.
Bernice, thanks very much. Amisha, turning to you, do you agree with that analysis, obviously from your perspective, focusing on offshore wind?
First, I'm just going to say that it's really hard to follow, Bernice. After
She's
that,
hard to follow.
actually, that's really hard to follow. But I'll do my best. I think looking at it from a sort of a sector point of view, and I'll refer to a report which was published by the Global Wind Energy Council, and my colleague Rebecca Williams, who's the Deputy Chief Exec there, spoke on a panel earlier on around grids and referenced this. Now, it states that apart from every region in the world except China will face supply chain constraints for the wind industry looking out to 2030. So I think for us, we're as an alliance and as an industry, but at the same time, sorry, I'll go back. The APAC region is the area which is being projected to have the most growth in offshore wind in that same time period. So there is an opportunity for collaboration there. But I think in any industry, diversification and manufacturing of the supply chain is prudent. So we want to encourage markets to take benefit of, again, the socioeconomic opportunities and the supply chain opportunities that can emerge in nations as well. So I think that's something that we're really we're working on with markets in the region. It's an opportunity for them to scale up their own supply chains, but then look at where collaboration can take form. And saying that, there's a lot of scope for regional collaboration, now, not just in APAC, but across the globe in offshore markets. And we've seen successes of this model as well. Starting close to home in the North Sea, we've seen the North Sea Energy Cooperation and the Northern Power Hub as well, really looking at the North Sea Power Hub as well, bringing nations together and really sharing and building manufacturing capabilities of key components, and also looking at important grid infrastructure as well. So regional collaboration is happening, and we want to see that replicated in APAC and other parts of the world as well. It's going to be critical for us to drive that supply chain capability moving forward, which is going to be essential to us meeting our targets.
Absolutely. Thank you, Amisha. Last question to you, Rachel. Obviously, we've talked a lot today about the importance of scaling up clean, renewable energy. We know to address the climate crisis, that's not enough. We also have to phase down the fossil fuel economy. We've talked a bit about coal today. What about oil and gas in all this? Arguably, geopolitical support for the expansion of oil and gas appears stronger than ever. Do you agree? And what scope do you think there is to scale up international alliances like the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance to reverse that trend?
So it's almost 10 years from Paris Agreement, right? So this is a big year. And I think so there's a lot of sort of lessons learning. Hopefully we're learning the right lessons, Bernice. But one of the fundamental issues for the climate movement and everybody associated with it is you can't ask people to switch the switch off, right, of the dirty energy until you can switch it on with the green energy. And we kind of got the balance wrong, I think. And there's lots of reasons for that, and it's not the climate movement's fault, right? But the emphasis was on phasing out, and that has to happen. And there's going to be a big fat tail of the fossil fuel industry as we phase out, and we are phasing out. But there are short-term profits to be made in coal in Asia at the moment. So when the banks tell you that they, left those banking alliances because they were afraid of the Attorney General in Texas, they were. But they can also make short-term profits on coal in Asia, and their deal teams are telling them that, right? 1. 2, gas is a bridge to somewhere for some countries. And I think there's a huge disruption in the sort of trust necessary for global partnership that came about when Russia invaded Ukraine. And we all went running around the world trying to get our hands on everybody's gas after having spent a decade telling them that they couldn't have it. And we're still reeling diplomatically from the And then we've got the petrostates of the Middle East who are playing the long game. And they know that in the middle of the this century, you know, or the second half of this century, they'll be producing the most efficiently, the cheapest last metric ton of gas and the last barrel of oil. And, you know, they're like, yeah, okay, Permian Basin, bring it on. They know that they will do that. And so they will manage their transition. And in fact, you know, the price of oil matters to how Saudi Arabia manages its transition. They will manage their transitions. They're heavily investing in AI. They're heavily investing in the other technologies that will help them manage it. And they know where they're going. And what they don't want is the rest of the world peering over their shoulder and like watch, you know, going through the books to see how they're doing it. That's their objection to the Paris Agreement. It's not necessarily that we're phasing out. It's that we don't actually want to be globally transparent and be part of some kind of transparency regime about how we're doing it and who we're doing it. So oil and gas, yes, we're transitioning away, but what we've really got to do is step up the investment in the green energy. And for the millions and millions and millions of Africans, and there's more millions of young Africans today than there were when the Paris Agreement was signed. They don't have reliable energy. And how on earth do you have faith in the future if you don't have energy? And we've got to find the way to help build out the grids, build out the regulations, put utilities in place that can manage this transition, and then invest. Because the world will become a very bleak place when you have that extraordinary number of young Africans without any hope.
Rachel, thank you very much. We're nearly out of time. The clock is ticking down and it's turned red. But I'd like to turn to each of you before we leave this stage and ask you, in your closing remarks, what gives you most hope? Where do you see the biggest opportunities for progress in 2025 on this agenda? Amisha.
I think that we're seeing, I think despite the news headlines and what we're seeing coming out and what's happening in the US, we are seeing positive shifts geopolitically as well, and nations are coming together on this agenda. And we definitely see that from an offshore wind perspective. My chance to plug, the Global Offshore Wind Alliance has already brought together over 20 governments, and that's, you know, within a 2-year time period. And we've got more incoming, but I'm not allowed to say who. So watch this space. And that just goes to show that there is a lot of momentum. Also, something that hasn't been mentioned was the tripling target, which was adopted in the UAE consensus. That there's significant momentum around that, and there's action being taken to address and look at some of the policy recommendations that coming out of that movement. And that's a multi-stakeholder alliance, governments with industry, civil society, and all players involved in the energy transition, making it happen. So I think it's easy to get down with the news and everything, but stay optimistic. And thank you to the Carbon Trust for putting on this excellent conference today.
Thank you very much, Amisha. Bernice, where are the beacons of light for you this year?
I think that when the first round of the mouthy runners and riders finished, even Indonesian, you know, the politician who talked about leaving Paris, they will remember that Indonesia has a lot of interest in exporting EVs. They will remember that Indonesia will suffer lots of climate impacts. And I think that it wouldn't be long before reason resumes in many parts of the world. And trusting that most people are ultimately sensible, I believe that it is possible to look forward to that. And secondly, look, folks talked about it on the panel, Rachel and others. There were things that we didn't quite get right. But nonetheless, this is now an opportunity to make sure that we are doing them right, whether we're talking social, whether we're talking about things, partnerships, equal partnerships, developing countries, etc. All of these things easier said than done, but however, this is a chance for us to really do it properly. So I look forward to that.
Fantastic. Rachel.
Well, Bernice is always one of my beacons of hope. But so to build on what has just been said, the things that we could do that would make a very, very big difference are kind of known knowns. So we know that if we can, you know, fix some of the grid issues, we've got 3 gigawatts of renewable energy in the world today that we can't put into a grid. You know, so we know how to, we've got examples of how to speed up the investment in renewable capability. We've got good news stories, and so we can just, so it's not as if we don't know exactly what we need to do. And the populist right-wing naysayers and the toxic sort of weaponization of net zero. These guys in opposition sound very compelling, especially when they're not contested, and especially when I've got a whole thing about the BBC, but we'll do that on another day. But when they get into power, they kind of don't know what to do. Look at Germany, AFD, look at in the Netherlands, in Portugal. And so, yes, young people in the European elections last year went straight from the Greens to the AFD. But when these right-wing parties get into power, it's not clear. I mean, what's the pathway? What are they going to do? Go back to coal? No. I mean, so the economics are not in their favour. And so I think we have to stand up and talk about what we know, and to just building up. I know we're out of time, but yes, all of the micro-polling shows that people want a clean community. They want clean air. They want clean water. They want flood defences. They want to have their grandfather go into a medical ward in a hospital and not be uncomfortable because of extreme heat. That's what they want. But they also want an energy bill that they can afford. Now, we know what we need to do to make that energy bill affordable. We know we can produce energy at a very reasonable price, as cheap as anywhere. But we, got certain things wrong and in the wrong order. So it's fixable. So we have to just fix it.
Thanks a lot, Rachel. Nick, the last word is yours.
Upside this year. I mean, the current sort of hyper whatever it is version of our economic system that's currently leading in the US is so mad that it's unsustainable. So the three richest men having more money than half of the American population put together. The US, and this is actually a Biden era, not a Trump era, the US contributing to the totemically important loss and damage fund, which took years in negotiation. The US contribution is 1/80,000th of its annual military spend. So even a government that is climate focused and committed to being a globally responsible citizen, that's the balance of perspective. So in that context, is a positive. In that context, this approach cannot sustain. It is so unsustainable. So the risk actually is with the big unsustainable countries of the industrial world who are so vulnerable. On contrast, you have billions of people in the global south who've been surviving on a knife edge with hardly any resource in an incredibly resilient way forever. And you have indigenous people and you have young people who can change and are more flexible than the older people. And so, I think you have to see the madness of this economic era for what it is, as well as some good elements, and see that actually the vast majority of people are in a different place with different priorities, different perspectives, and different levels of resilience.
Nick, thank you very much indeed. We are way past our deadline, apologies, but I hope you agree with me that was worthwhile. A huge thank you to every single member of the panel.